Hi, welcome. We're glad that you've joined us today. Today, we're doing one of our series of webinars that are based on the National Perinatal Association's recommendations for the psychosocial support of NICU parents. Today, we're going to be covering one of the very important topics that's covered in the recommendations, and that's family-centered developmental care. I'm your host, Erica Goyer. I'm a parent and family advocate with the National Perinatal Association. And alongside me today is my co-host, Crystal Grogan, who is a parent advocate also, and she's a member of the Preemie Parent Alliance and also a member of the board of the National Perinatal Association. We're going to be talking with two very smart, very well-informed, and helpful presenters today, Natalie Gordon and Janine Craig. And like I said, this is one of a series of webinars that we're recording on these recommendations that were published by the National Perinatal Association. In these recommendations, we cover 6 different domains that we think are fundamental to supporting NICU families and NICU staff. And you can see some of the topics that we have within the recommendations. I really encourage you to go and not just listen to this webinar, but listen to the other conversations that we've had with parents and professionals on these topics. Today, we're really going to focus on how to involve families in developmental care and what family-centered developmental care looks like in a neonatal intensive care unit. If you're interested in looking at these recommendations and learning more about them, they are all outlined in the publication. There was a special supplement of the Journal of Perinatology that was published at the end of 2015. And it has a wonderful first opening paragraph and article that talks about the recommendations, what the rationale are for them. You know, as we sat down and we wanted to look at how to deliver better care to these families, we realized that we really needed a broad interdisciplinary perspective. So we invited people from all across the perinatal and neonatal realms to participate in creating these guidelines. At the center of it are our parent advocates. Parents were involved in the creation and the publication of all of the recommendations. And they were joined by just an amazing team of interdisciplinary professionals, everything from, neonatologists to neonatal therapists, lactation support. Everybody was brought to the table so that we could come up with the best possible recommendations that we could. And again, the great thing about these is these are, unlike some other journal articles that you go and you try to look at and you bump up against that paywall, that's not going to be the case here because we've made sure that these are open access and available to anybody who wants to read them. Because we hope that you will read them. One, they provide just this tremendous rationale and all the supporting evidence for why these practices are so important. But beyond that, we go in and talk about how to implement them. In fact, we have not just these publications, but we'll talk later about just a whole host of resources that we've created to help parent advocates and NICU advocates figure out how to adopt these practices and how to put them into action in their NICUs and in their communities as families transition from NICU to home. So I'll tell you a little bit about those who are with us today presenting. So Janine Craig, right now she just started a new position. She's Program Director of Infant and Early Childhood Development Program at Fielding Graduate University. Janine is a parent and a neonatal therapist with just years of experience in different perinatal and neonatal settings. She, in fact, has such a passion for this that she is the director of education for a national organization that supports neonatal therapists. That's NANT, the National Association of Neonatal Therapists, who offer wonderful resources and trainings for anybody who is practicing within that realm. She is a PhD in infant and childhood disorders and has an emphasis in mental health and understanding developmental disabilities. I've heard her speak many times nationally, not yet internationally. I'm working on that one, but I know she does, and shares the wealth of knowledge that she has in how to best support these infants. She's joined by one of our parent advocates who is also an author on this section of the recommendations for psychosocial support. Natalie Gordon works full-time as a program facilitator for a program, a nonprofit organization that's called NICU Helping Hands. They're based out of Fort Worth, Texas. And one of the fantastic things about Natalie's job is that she gets to work full-time in the settings where she can support NICU families, whether it's in the NICU itself. First, it was at Baylor's All Saints. Now she's at Cook Children's Medical Center, but also following up with families as they enter the developmental follow-up programs that are available for a lot of NICU graduates. So you can also find her at the Nest Clinic at Cook Children's, where she is able to continue to support families that she started working with when they were in the NICU. And Natalie is also a mom. Her experience is not just professional. She also has, is a real expert by experience too, because Natalie is the parent not just to a teenager, but also to twins who were born back in 2019, and they were just 24 weeks gestation when they were born. So she is intimately familiar with that side of the NICU experience too. So to get started, well, first of all, I went back and I was reading what you guys wrote in these recommendations. And I seldom do this, but I thought this was really smart, and I'm going to read it in its entirety. But this is a quote from the recommendations, and it kind of talks about what's the foundation to this work we do. And it is family-centered developmental care, which is also referred to as Fcdc, recognizes the family as vital members in the NICU healthcare team. As such, families are integrated into the decision-making processes and are collaborators in their baby's care. A foundation is constructed to enhance the family's lifelong relationship with their child and optimize development of the baby. And another thing that I thought that was in there that addresses so beautifully what we're going to be talking about is that while these babies are in the NICU, even though it's an unanticipated event often, and not necessarily where babies are supposed to spend the first few days of their lives, that while they're there, there is such focus and attention and consideration and care given to meeting those babies and their basic needs as a human being. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to ask you, Janine, tell us a little bit about developmental care and family-centered developmental care. What are we talking about when we're talking about these subjects?
Well, thank you, Erica. I think our past kind of informs our future or present. And I think appreciating the history of developmental care is really important. And perhaps a good starting place is really to reflect for a moment on, for me, a particular transition point in the history of developmental care. And that, I guess, being an old dog with 37 years of experience as a therapist is good in that I have a long-lived experience around just how much NICU caregiving has changed over the years. And probably the most significant impact came around the early 1980s in our shift out of what we used to refer to as traditional care and into developmental care. And really, it all revolved around how we actually view the capacities of our preterm babies and our critically ill babies. And so with the advent of Dr. Heidel Zoll's work and her synaptive theory of development, we really began to consider these tiny and medically fragile babies as having some remarkable competencies and also some fragile developmental needs. And so in traditional care, I kind of shudder to think back on this, we recognized that the sensory system input was important. However, it was really a one-size-fits-all approach, and every baby received kind of their dosing, if you will, of sensory input, rocking, the black and white mobiles, and so on. But then with the theoretical underpinnings of the synaptive theory and research that was being completed, we really began to look at each baby as their own unique self. And so we really considered different systems, the autonomic system, the motor system, the sensory system, self-regulation, etc. But the sensory system is something that we are able to think a little more visibly about, if you will, and really consider specific sensory-based guidelines around things such as the auditory system, tactile, vestibular, kinesthetic or touch, olfactory or their smell, and looking at different interventions that we utilize with preterm infants in the NICU. And so it really, that transition from traditional care to developmental care really launched us into our view of considering each baby as an individual.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating too, because they think about these babies and what the environment was that they came from, and then the environment that they're now in that they're not necessarily developmentally prepared for, especially if they're born preterm, or if you have a baby maybe who's been sick and their development has been interrupted by some of the interventions. But I think it's just so compelling, the idea that there's now such a focus on making sure that even when we're delivering these, critical intensive care interventions, that there's still a way to do it that's developmentally supportive.
Absolutely. And regardless of what it is that we're talking about, what task or what work that we do, there is always the availability and the necessity to consider what is neuroprotective, which is a word that we've more moved into today, what is really age appropriate, because there's a difference between the needs developmentally of a 24-weeker versus a 37-weeker. So really adjusting their age and providing developmentally appropriate interactions that are supportive of the medical caring that has to occur. There's such a depth of knowledge and of consideration regarding outcomes,
Yeah.
that we really have to consider throughout whatever we do in the NICU.
And it's, you mentioned Heidi Zalls and her kind of groundbreaking work, but it is such a shift. It's still shocking to me to imagine that there was a time that we really even thought that some of these neonates didn't even experience pain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, we know that developmental care looks at, what are the particular, vulnerabilities of an infant, what are their strengths, where they're doing well, and then, that idea carries over into talking about family-centered developmental care, and that shift, that each baby needs individualized care, each family does too. So now that we have kind of a better understanding about what, developmental care is and what the principles are, can you tell us about how that translates into this new paradigm that is family-centered developmental care?
Sure, absolutely. I think that the first word is family. So thinking about parents as part of the team is essential. It's critical for so many different reasons that Natalie and I will talk about and share about today, and really being hands-on as early on as possible. It's a multidisciplinary perspective that we'll also talk about, and part of that multidisciplinary work includes and must involve the work that the parents and the family bring as the team, and we need to consider what each person does to assist in making this parent-infant dyad connection and well-being in our medical space the most supportive as possible. And then really, really importantly is addressing so many of the fears that parents have that are unspoken, and also supporting the hopes that they have, because they come into our NICU experience with really shattered dreams of the picture that they imagined would happen. And how we partner with those parents involves us getting to know them so that we know what their fears are. And so that we know what their desires are, their dreams are. And again, this gets so much into much more than just this one webinar can provide, but considering the individual cultural needs of the family. And I don't mean not just like what country are they from, because that certainly matters, but for so many different ways of describing the family culture. And then also the fears that the staff have. You know,
Mm,
their staff have their own wonderings about, if I do this, is this going to be good or bad? And
yeah.
so kind of coming together.
No doubt. And I think you brought up, a couple important things, and I'm going to ask Natalie, to talk about it more. In fact, as we're getting ready for this webinar, Natalie kind of reminded us. I think those of us that work in the NICU and talk about this all the time, you really can lose sight of what a traumatic experience this is, and that parent-infant dyad, that expectation that you had has been so broken and so disruptive, and it's scary. And you know, I know we've talked about before, you and me, Natalie, one of the first things that parents often ask is, my baby going to survive? And sometimes that has nothing to do with the medical acuity, but it does have to do with those fears and hopes and expectations that we had, and how we're now in this really foreign place. But Natalie, as somebody who's had that experience and also has worked in the NICU, what can you say, talking about how can we best support these families, and how can we better understand what it is that they're experiencing, so that we can set them up to have the best possible outcomes?
Sure. Well, I can talk absolutely on a personal level about my experience. And while there was not actual parent support in the NICU that my twins were in, the staff really did put out their best efforts to, kind of adopt this family-centered care model before it was even really being implemented. And so I was given this incredible opportunity just about 10 years ago. August 30th will be 10 years,
Hmm.
where they had me meet with my neonatologist, the nurses that we had that day, and our developmental therapist. And we would all talk about the plan, and I was given the opportunity to voice what my hopes were for the day, whether that be a kangaroo care or if it was bath day, and what medically had to be done. And then we'd come to a compromise on what I was getting to do. And so that really laid the groundwork for me as a parent, in an environment where we feel so second nature. We know that those are our babies and those isolettes, but you feel so detached because there's thick plastic in between you and your child, and all the medical staff knows exactly what they need to do, and we're just kind of sitting in the chair waiting for someone to tell us if or when we can touch our baby.
Yeah.
So being able to feel like you're a part of that early on really lays the groundwork to where when you go home post NICU. So when we went home, both of our children had 6 specialists apiece in all 3 disciplines of developmental therapy.
Yeah.
And so post NICU was a full-time job, to say the least. But what I learned in the NICU from our team that rallied around us prepared me and armed me for how to become a team with all of our specialists and then all of our developmental therapists, to where we wholeheartedly believed in that process. And we followed that through all the way until everybody looked at us and said, okay, you are finally done. We're checking this box off. So it was instrumental in the rest of, not just in the NICU, but well into our post-NICU journey.
Yeah.
And then,
No, go ahead, please.
well, and I was just going to say, on a professional level, I do work with these families that are currently in the NICU, and the ones that are able to, really practice this family-centered care process and do it, from day one all the way through discharge. When we see them in the follow-up clinic, they are thriving post NICU. They are all doing very, very well. There might be one area that they're struggling, but as a whole, this family unit is really functioning. Whereas the families that, for whatever reason, drug addiction, low socioeconomic situation, whatever it was, if they did not latch onto that family-centered care, when we see them post NICU in the follow-up clinic, the whole unit is in shambles. We're looking at broken families who have either already divorced or they're living in two separate households. The children are not getting the follow-up care that they need because the parents are just too distraught to get them where they need to go. So it is absolutely instrumental in having this in place in the NICU to allow these families to go on and be successful post-NICU.
Absolutely. Natalie, I love what you just said. And if I may, I'd really like to put an exclamation point behind that. I think the earliest that we can start, the earliest starting point that we have available to us is the most important point of joining a parent with a baby. And that should not start at discharge. And it needs to start at admission. And I think over the years, I've had many influencing experiences with parents and with a number of themes that have kind of percolated to the surface. But the one persistent theme that seems to really resonate over and over and over again are parent fears while they're in the NICU. And so my question is, how do we even tap into what the fears are of those parents? One of the most profound experiences I had was actually doing some research. I was meeting with parents within the first 2 weeks after discharge, and one of my participants was a nurse of many years experience, and she had a NICU baby, and she was so detached from her son, and she was so fearful while she was in the unit of retaliation by the NICU staff. She was afraid to say something because she was afraid somebody would retaliate and it would show up actually against her baby. Now, cognitively, she realized that really didn't make sense, because as a nurse, she would have never done that. And yet her sense of attachment and connection with her baby was joined with because of her fear that she had in the NICU. And then, as a NICU therapist and seeing these children post NICU in pediatric clinics, there's so much work to be done just in the pediatric world in how joining parents in the therapy sessions with their children is an opportunity for making sure that connection is there. So I just wanted to add to your beautiful narrative, Natalie.
Well, and to add to that, I see it every day. I felt it every day. And if families are at the center of their baby's care, they are more apt to trust the medical team, the suggestions that are going on. They're going to be more understanding of their touch times and what is important, because otherwise they're feeling like someone is just constantly telling them no, 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 which makes you feel inadequate as a parent. So, putting them at the forefront and in the center of their child's care is going to help tremendously in the trust area. And that bleeds into, I trust you, so I'm going to go home and take care of myself for a minute, which leads into their mental health. And I will share, even as good a care as I was given in the NICU during our journey, 3 months post NICU, I ended up with a full NICU PTSD diagnosis. And so for the next 4 years, I spent 2 days a week with a therapist and medication on board, to try to process everything that we had been through and, get some skills in my back pocket to cope with all the valleys and the roads and the hills that we were still going through post NICU. So that family-centered care just plays into every facet of a family's life.
Oh my gosh. And family-centered, developmental care, it recognizes the family as really vital members of the NICU healthcare team. And what you're describing, Natalie, is just how important that strong foundation is for families while they're in the NICU, because essentially what we're doing is optimizing lifelong relationships. And we're addressing so many things. We're addressing vulnerabilities of the baby from a developmental standpoint, but also vulnerabilities of the parents, of the family units, because what you've experienced is, it's lifelong, right?
Right. Absolutely. And I still have, those good days and bad days. I've made incredible improvements. Obviously, I'm able to go into the NICU and, work with families that have very, very similar diagnoses to my children. But it was a long process to recover from that. And so, and I was blessed in the care that we received. So I can only imagine how broken a family would be if this family-centered care is not being implemented in NICU.
It really brings home again how important this is, and we're not going to speak to it directly, but also just how important it is that providers also understand trauma-informed care, because if you're a family or if you're a parent coming in and maybe you already have a mental health diagnosis. Many of us do. 1 in 6 of us does. Maybe you've had trauma in your background. Maybe that trauma took place in the medical setting. Maybe you're already not sure whether you trust providers because maybe you perceive that there's bias or that you're not seen as a valued expert on your healthcare and your baby's healthcare. And yet this is, when done right, this is such an opportunity to transform people's relationships with each other, with their baby, with their provider. And so, whatever vulnerabilities we bring in, whether it's, a baby or a family where there's substance exposure, or a family that has, language barriers, or a situation in which there might be cultural or class differences, when we meet families where they're at and really work with them, we can set everybody up for just a lifetime of success. And if we don't say it enough, the work that you guys do in the NICU is so very, very important. And I I love the way that you're sharing too about how personal experience, your own or parents as they're having it in the NICU, can really improve the sort of care that we deliver. And so I'm curious to know more about how that's informed the sort of care that you give, or how it influences how you talk with families.
I think that's a great question, and I think it's that every person, whether they are a NICU staff person or a parent, we come with our personal and our professional experiences both. And for me, it certainly has informed my current work. My personal experience as well as my professional experience has informed my current work over the years. And probably the most profound, when I think back on my journey, was my firstborn and her entrance into the world, which was expected to be pretty typical term delivery. My first baby, she was full term, but it became quite quickly a life and death experience for both of us. And it was quite a traumatic experience. I was put out for the delivery and really didn't wake up for another 24 hours. So I didn't know for a full day that I even had a baby and that it was a little girl. And then I didn't get to hold her for quite some time after that. But the fears that came to me that were born out of that experience. I was a brand new therapist. I was a brand new occupational pediatric therapist, and the fears that were born in me from that delivery. I did every developmental assessment there was on her, of course, but just the lived experience of not being able to hold her, not knowing if she was okay, really launched a passion in me that undergirded much of my professional work. And as an OT and neonatal therapist, from my professional lens, our professional organizations, which just for clarity for listeners, neonatal therapists are OTs, and so our professional organization is the AOTA, PTs and professional organization of APTA, and then ASHA for speech language pathologists. And our professional organizations define the NICU really as a specialized practice setting because of the medical and developmental fragility of the infants that we see, the vulnerable emotional status of the families that Natalie has already touched on, and then the intricacy of the medical goings on, the cultural experiences, again defined in a number of different ways, the social factors, all that impact that family infant dyad. And so NANT, our National Association of Neonatal Therapists, really serves as a central touch point to all things neonatal therapy related. And that's where a lot of my professional support comes from: education, mentoring, research, and so on. But from a professional neonatal therapist standpoint, that's where I guess I have the capability of coming with some foundational knowledge on neonatal medical conditions, knowing the intensive care equipment, preterm infant development, the developmental pathways according to different gestational ages, but also, and most importantly, embracing the family systems dynamics. And again, my personal lens has informed my professional lens, because I think it all contributes to the development of this beautiful collaborative management plan. And the collaborative management plan is the NICU staff, the family, the baby. And it's really, again, it's what we promote in terms of long-term outcomes, that joining of the parents with the families. And that's what our interventions should be around. So anyway, let me just pause, and I know Natalie has so much to offer from her perspective, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, well, something that you were just speaking about made me think of another point I wanted to bring up here. I was terrified of our neonatologist. She, and she knows this, the first 2 or 3 weeks, I don't think I spoke a word. I would just shake my head yes or no when she would ask questions, and anything that she had to say. I mean, just terrified, because my perspective was, I'm just a mom whose body just failed her. And so I'm the reason these babies are in this NICU. So what right do I have to ask you a single thing? So just to give you some perspective on how I felt in there. And so she picked up on this, and 2 weeks in, she came in with 2 spiral notebooks, and she had my daughter's name on one and my son's name on the other. And she handed them to me, and she pulled up a chair and she said, here's what we're going to do going forward. She said, this is your daughter's notebook and this one's your son. Every day I'm going to meet you at 8:05 in this room, and we are going to talk about the last 24 hours and every single thing that I did medically, and what the developmental team is suggesting or has done, and what the nursing team is going to do today. And so I would sit there with her for 30 minutes and write down every single thing that she did. 1 ml of this, 2.5 mLs of that, what the developmental plan was, every single thing. And she said, and if you don't know what something is, I want you to stop me and I want you to ask, and we're going to discuss it. If you don't know how to spell something, I want you to stop me and ask. So for the next 3 or 4 weeks, we did this daily. And it taught me two things. Number one, it taught me all of the medical information and terminology that I needed to know from my children, which was, that's just the amount of power that gives a parent is incredible. And the second thing it made me do was I would review that list every night before going to bed. And it would prompt me to ask questions. Well, wait a minute. Why did we do this? Well, wait a minute. Last week we weren't doing that, but now we are, or vice versa. And so I would walk into the unit the next morning and say, hey, I have questions for you. I don't understand this. And the time that was taken by her and the nurses and then the developmental team when I would have those questions, or if I said, well, I really wanted to do this today. And if the answer was ever no, we can't do that, it was always followed up with a explanation of why that wouldn't be in the best interest of our babies. And that just helped tremendously. And so I took that medical journal philosophy with me the entire way. I still do it to this day. I did it last year in the summer meeting with the school board, trying to come up with a plan for my kids going into the 4th grade. So how parents perceive their role in this and how they're informed about the care. And there was one point my son ended up with a grade 4 brain bleed. And we were talking about signing a DNR and being able to be given information on both sides to come to an answer on what was best care. That's something that I will be forever grateful for, forever. So again, it's just all so intuitive and intertwined. That's all I wanted to add there.
Natalie, what that reminds me of just really, really quickly is that we're following the lead of each other in the unit. That
Agreed.
You bring so much to the table as a parent, and it is not the medical team necessarily leading the parent. It's the bidirectional relationship of the parents and the NICU staff leading each other and following.
Yes.
And it's just, it's so brilliant. Like you said, it's just 10 years ago, and we had gathering evidence that there was really a place for this sort of family-centered developmental care. And it sounds like your provider was an early adopter, an innovator, and realized how this could change things. And it's just so important. I want to take a moment, we have to address so often now the sort of disparities and inequities that can exist in medical care, and that we know based on research out of places like Stanford, exists in the NICU. And yet what great potential family-centered developmental care has in being a way to remediate a lot of these disparities and inequities. Because if every family gets that sort of personal attention, if they get their needs met, if they're getting to have these conversations, whether they're able to be in the NICU during regular hours or not, there's such potential for setting up families and parents for success that's one of the reasons why these recommendations, they have to be adopted, they have to be universal, and there have to be policies so that the tremendous care that you got, Natalie, and the tremendous care that you give, Janine, don't just happen by accident because a parent's lucky enough to get to be beside you, but that we can make it happen for everyone.
Well, and I think to your point, Erica, disparities and inequities, I think on the planet today, we're trying really hard to describe what that means and how to address it. It's not just saying that there's a problem, but it's really articulating what do we do with it. But what comes to mind is we can describe this in a number of different ways. By populations, we can describe it like family to family and individual differences that they bring, but also the disparities and inequities from one unit to the next, in that why aren't we doing the delivery of services the way that Natalie received it?
Right.
Why are we not doing that in every single unit? So there's a lot of work to be done on the planet still, and but there's a lot of hope as well, because we do have units that are doing remarkable work, and they should be the gold standard for every unit, and it should be an expectation. So
Yeah. Well,
I,
and I think
and
that's
I
what
have to,
motivates all our work.
right. And I have to say, in the 10 years since we've been there, yes, I received great care, but the improvement that I see from then to now is so exciting and inspiring. So I know we're making great progress. We've just got to make sure this is done in every unit.
Yeah.
yes.
And it really emphasizes kind of what things looked like in the past, as far as, I mean, we forget that neonatology it's a young field. I mean, the first NICUs appeared late 60s, early 70s, and it, because it's so young, because it's changing so rapidly, each of us, just in the time that we've been working in NICUs, have seen that shift in what goes on. And one of the things the recommendations talk about that I think is so important is this decision making process. So I'm curious what each of your observations are on that specific aspect of care.
So I think, again, looking back at where we've come from, this is just a reminder that the decision making piece has to at some level, of course, it has to address the medical well-being of the infant first, right? But it has to also include the participation of the parent. Even if the parent doesn't feel that they can make like a final decision about problem A, the fact that they are being joined in the decision making process is the first step in the journey of this parent feeling like this is actually their baby, right?
Absolutely. I can think of a particular family that I was very involved in, whose baby, it was suggested that they get a tracheostomy. And of course, for every parent, and I'm sure medical professional, that's last resort, right? We don't want to do that if we can avoid it at all. But at this point, the staff was pretty convinced that a trach was going to be 100%, and the family just really wanted some more time. So we pulled around together in what we call a care conference. I don't know what everyone else calls them, but so where we had the specialist, the neos, the primary nurses, myself, the family, and you just kind of go around the table and everybody speaks their piece. And it was incredible to me to get to witness this back and forth conversation and this compromise that this family ended up, when I was talking to them before this care conference took place, Mom was very teary, very upset. She said, I know it's going to be them against us and we're going to lose. And my son's going to have to undergo a tracheostomy. And I told her to keep an open mind and to be positive and, all of that stuff. And when we walked out, she was smiling. She had happy tears. Like she said, and she looked at me, she said, I feel like I was heard. We got a good compromise. I'm very comfortable with it. Dad was elated. So, the ability to let families speak what they're wanting, and then the medical staff still protecting that child and making sure that child is getting best practice, best cares. But allowing a little bit of give and take and letting that family feel like they've got some power and some pull in that was incredible. And I see that a lot, like a lot more the last couple of years than I have in years past, which is very exciting to me.
Well, and I think, when we look at the NICU, it's a multidisciplinary space, just as it is in other units of the hospital, right? And
Right.
each discipline has its own frame of reference from their own, professional space. But when you add to that each parent's unique perspective and their understanding and their experience, if you will, it really enhances that shared decision making process, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Natalie, I'd like to ask, so we know your personal story. Can you describe a little more your progression from, the parent side and being in the NICU to being more on the advocate side and the role you play in the NICU now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, delivering my twins at 24 weeks changed my very core of who I was as a person. I've already mentioned how timid and insignificant I felt when we were in the NICU setting for the first month or so. And I just kind of felt like a part-time person in the beginning and not really a valuable member. And I remember sitting there one day, we were about 2 weeks in, and my son, it came into play with his grade 4 bleed. I watched him get bagged 12 times within a 60-minute period. And it was aggressive. I was asked to leave the room. It took them several minutes to bring him back each time. And I will never forget that feeling of not knowing what this meant for myself, for my son, for his future, and just sitting there feeling so incredibly isolated and lonely that I vowed I would do everything I could within my power once I got my kids to a point where I could leave them again and go back to work, so that no other parent felt as alone and isolated as I did. And so being able to go from parent to advocate, I mentioned earlier, luckily for me, happened very early on, considering this was 10 years ago, and I mentioned the medical notebook. But I remember specifically our developmental team, and it was an opportunity for me to get to practice infant massage. And I remember being so nervous and so scared. And it literally the infant massage started for my kids. It was 2 fingers that I was pressing just ever so slightly on their arm and going as far down as I could until they wouldn't tolerate it anymore. And so in the beginning, that was maybe 8 or 9 seconds. And, within several weeks, I was able to go, massage their entire body. And so learning that and having the therapist teach me about what was happening and why that touch was being received as either a negative or a positive, really laid that groundwork for me of, gosh, I really need to educate myself. I need to understand what's going on behind the scenes so that when we're in front of the specialists and the doctors and everyone else, I'm asking the right questions, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so it was early for me, and that has gone all the way through to now in grade school. So I don't know, or in elementary school, sorry. I don't know what it's like for everyone else in, other states, but in my state, they will not do testing on children before the 3rd grade. They say that they are too young and they won't get a good idea of the testing. And if I learned anything in the NICU, it was that with severely premature infants, the sooner you find out, the better. And the better of the odds are that we can overcome something. And so that did not sit well with me. And when they made it out of kindergarten into first grade, I had kids starting to come home saying, "Gosh, I'm the stupidest kid in my class." And one night, which just killed me, I heard, "I don't deserve to be in this family. I'm not as smart as you guys." And I thought, this isn't okay, and this isn't normal, and I'm not just going to sit on this. And so I went to the principal and I said, "I need them tested, and I need them tested now." And they got the same spiel. "We don't do this before third grade." And I was adamant. I said, "I'm not leaving here without the opportunity to talk to somebody." And he said, "Okay." He got me in touch with the school board. I went in front of the school board with all my medical information of why I felt like this was necessary. And, wouldn't you know it, after it was all said and done, we got the testing, we found out where they were deficient and proficient, and we got accommodations in the classroom, starting in the first grade. So, it's so important to teach these families that you're not just the parent, you are your child's voice. And so becoming a part of that is really what's going to set them up for success. And at the end of that, at school, we ended up with a family-centered care situation, in the way that they all worked with us and got those processes in place. So it was really cool to see it come full circle.
Absolutely. What sorts of things do you do as a program facilitator in the hospital to partner with the care teams, to kind of ensure that family-centered developmental care is delivered?
Yeah. So luckily, when I was in the NICU, it's a lot of the same NEOs, and then in the nursing staff, of course, when I moved over to Cook, it was a whole new set of nurses. But I spent a lot of time conversing with them and talking to them, finding out, asking them about particular families, and are we struggling in certain areas, and how can I help alleviate that? And so building that trust between myself and the medical team is incredibly important. And then, going back to the family, and I call it like it is. I'm not medical. I am I am just a parent that is post NICU that, is here to help support and educate you in any way possible. And so I bring something to the table that no one else in the unit can, and that's just being a parent there to listen. And so it's really important for me to know where my scope starts and ends. So I'll, in talking to them, if it's gas or, a place to stay, I know that at that point I need to stop, even though I may know what those resources are. I need to stop and make sure they've met their social worker. Or if they mention to me, "Gosh, the doctor came in and this was not the plan that we thought was going to happen, and he just told us X, Y, and Z." And I know the NEOs pretty well, so I'll go back out and I'll say, "Hey, Dr. So-and-so, can I ask you about, this family? This is what they heard." And 9 times out of 10, the NEO will say, "Oh my gosh, that's not at all what I meant," or "That's not at all what I was trying to say. Let's go back in and do it again." And so I'm kind of in there with them, facilitating, making sure their questions are getting answered, and maybe asking them in different ways to make sure that all of us are on the same page and, providing that family-centered care.
I love that. And I love the, that scope of practice that you talk about. Janine, can I ask you to elaborate a little more on your side of things, on partnering, of seeing parents and partners kind of, integrating into, the family-centered developmental care in the NICU?
Sure, absolutely. Natalie, I love that you even use the phrase "your scope of practice," because parents do have a scope of practice. And while that's largely, I think, a more of a medical term or phrase, the fact that you have just so beautifully articulated really what your scope of practice is, not just in the NICU, but also post-NICU as a parent, in advocating for your children's needs. That is your scope of practice, right? And so in the NICU, For me, as a NICU therapist, I think it's always important that we understand what our roles are and what the scope of practice really involves. And for me, from my professional standpoint, I come from a core scope of practice that is kind of rooted in my professional training, if you will, and that outlines part of my work. And then, of course, my licensure also I have to attend to as well in terms of the things I can or cannot do. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for the joining of professionals and parents in the delivery of whatever it is. I think back on an experience with one of my family members when she was 8 months old, was intubated, and we had a significant challenge extubating her. And at that point, I was the parent. I was not the seasoned professional because my brain wouldn't allow me to think from so much a professional standpoint. But I asked the neonatologist, can I hold her while you extubate her? Because they'd already had a couple of attempts where they had to reintubate her quickly. And I said, can you just allow me to hold her and let's try again? And so what happened was they extubated her in my arms, and I was able to soothe and comfort her through my therapeutic touch, my parental touch, and it was a beautifully successful happening. And it's all because this physician joined me in the caring of this precious 8-month-old, and allowed. It was just beautiful, and that is family-centered, developmentally supportive caregiving. And so I try as much as I can to have that joining and help facilitate the parent's self-efficacy of caregiving, their confidence that they can actually do something and be successful at it, and that this is their thing, which is, why kangaroo care, and we've not talked about that yet, but, why kangaroo care is such a powerful developmental opportunity and a powerful mental health, social, emotional opportunity for families, which is a whole nother talk in and of itself, right?
Yes.
Well, that brings us to, I think, a natural transition, which, Janine, as we've had this discussion, thank you so much. This has been the stories that you've shared and the examples that you've given have been so employment. I really appreciate it. We both, Crystal and I, do. But as we're going away from this discussion, there are some things we haven't hit on yet, but there are other things that we probably want to talk about more. But if we're going away from this and there were only a few points, Janine, that families and providers took with them, what would you want them to remember?
Well, I think, of course, embracing families as the full care partner with a NICU team is where the gold happens. It really helps empower and support, as I just mentioned, the parents and the family's self-efficacy and caring for their baby, and in a place where they can try things and feel supported, but they have to feel like the healthcare team is there to support them, and that they're not being judged, and that there's the vulnerability that can be explored together. And so also really encouraging parents' presence and the interaction with their babies. So allowing that, I don't even like saying the word allow, because that shouldn't even be in our vocabulary, but partnering with them and encouraging parents to be there and interacting with their babies can lead to improved developmental outcomes. We know this for the babies, and then also improved mental health status for the parents, as Natalie is really articulated with her own personal story with her postpartum experience. And then we mentioned skin to skin here. I talked about kangaroo care just for a split second. it really does provide so many positive benefits to the babies from a physiological standpoint, from a developmental standpoint, and really should be a key feature in any of our NICU programs in our delivery of family-centered developmental care, and not just a nod to it, not just do an hour here or an hour there, but the power that exists behind doing skin to skin. And let me just share a 30-second example of where this became most meaningful to me. Many, many years ago, probably at least 25, we had a baby who was not doing well and was not expected to survive. He had been there for a year already in the NICU and just really was not progressing, and then he started getting worse. Mom was not able to hold him, and this was prior to a lot of our skin-to-skin care initiatives. And so I said, can this mom just hold this baby? Can she just hold him? And just let's not put any constraints on it. She can hold him as long as she wants to, because if he is not going to be with us, let's at least allow them to be together. So this mom came in, just held the baby like 24/7. And all of a sudden the baby started to improve. And long story short, this baby went home. And I am convinced, nobody can convince me otherwise, that it's because of that skin to skin care that mom did for at least a full week of being with her baby that really was a turning point. And then there's so many other things that I could say, but parents and babies both benefit when the parents are given information about what a preterm baby's behaviors look like what's to be expected. Because if they haven't had a preterm experience before, they may not know about neurobehavioral cues and neurobehavioral organization. And so they may be touching their baby in a way that the baby might not receive as a good positive touch. So how we join in the partnership with the parents and how we help the parents see neurobehavioral signs of stress and stability empowers that parent to then tell us, here's what my baby is doing today. Here is their strength. Here are the places where you as the nurse, you as the therapist can support my baby. I'm really being sensitive to and responsive to their baby's needs. So those are probably my top points.
Jean, I love the quote you said about, not just taking a nod to these practices and really implementing them and embracing them. I think that's great. Now, Natalie, I'd like to ask you, what you think some takeaways would be on your end of things. What you think, what guidelines that your NICU parent leaders can help implement in the NICU.
Yeah. So I think my most important takeaway for me, just because it played such a pivotal role and still does to this day, is teaching our parents how to be advocates. And that doesn't take a whole lot of time or resources, honestly. It's just, it can be as simple as like what my neonatologist did and provide a notebook, which I do to every one of our families. NICU Helping Hands gives everybody a notebook, and just have them kind of go through and write down what their understanding is from the medical team for that day, to help teach and educate them, providing them with good medical factual information on their baby's diagnosis, instead of just delivering that and then letting them hop on Dr. Google and go that route. And so just providing that availability to teach them how to advocate so that they can be successful post-NICU as well is probably one of my biggest takeaways. And the best way to do that, again, is allowing the parents to be the very center, the very heart of the care of their baby for developmentally centered care. And parent leaders have a gift of being able to influence the NICU culture. And that's a precious thing that we shouldn't take for granted, and that NICU shouldn't take for granted. And I spent a lot of time working in between the staff and our families, and they respect the role that I play. They know that I'm not going to overstep my bounds on either side of the table. And so I think it's really important that, having your parent advocate, you can't just go in there and root for the parents, and you can't just go in there and take sides with the medical team. There's got to be that good balance of both, and being able to embrace your role, and learning how to ask for guidance and education on what you should be doing with these families and with the staff is going to go a long ways to help make sure these families are successful post-NICU as well.
I think that's so brilliant. I mean, one of the things, that you both referred to, but that you said so eloquently, Natalie, is, don't underestimate the influence that you have. And as we've had all these different, discussions of the different aspects and different domains of the recommendations on psychosocial support, again and again, those themes keep emerging. And it's, things can change, things will change. Families are in a unique position to make it happen. And when we find providers that we can collaborate with, and when we mentor each other and other parents, and we sit down and we build interdisciplinary initiatives and programs, that things are getting better. And it's not just that they're getting better, institution-wide or across systems, but that things are getting better for each family. And we know what that means, and we know what the potential of that is. And I'm so grateful for so many of the very thoughtful things that you both have said today, and immensely grateful for the work that each of you do. Crystal and I have both had the benefit of seeing you talk about what you do and explain and to share your insights with us. And it's just so important. And, like I said, we don't say it enough. Thank you for what you do every day. But thank you very, very much for sitting down and having this conversation with us. So we're doing all sorts of awesome things. But that being said, our takeaway can't just be that, patting ourselves on the back. It has to be what's next. So I'm going to ask you first, Janine, what do you think the next steps are? What should they be? What can they be? What are you excited about right now in the evolution of family-centered developmental care?
Well, that's a loaded question, but I think we have to be there. You mentioned neonatology is a relatively young profession, and yet within a span of 15 years after its inception, we had a major switch from traditional to developmental care. And so why has it taken so many decades of talking about family-centered developmental care, and we're still having this conversation? So I think, first of all, our caregiving has to be consistent with the central tenets of developmental care, and we have a really good understanding of what that means. And that, of course, it must involve the parents at a minimum. And so the next step, I think, is just kind of my brainstorm in my head is, we have annual competencies as professionals that we have to meet. I do for my licensure. I do for working in the NICU. I do for my job as a professor. I have annual competencies that I have to meet. And we have to have annual competencies for the institution. And so that would be, if you will, a checklist of these are the foundational non-negotiables. This has to happen. For example, do you have the parent voice, a parent advocate? That's not negotiable. And so that's what I think the next step is. It's not an easy thing, but I don't want to have a visceral response walking into a NICU that is not even doing the basic fundamental stuff. Yeah. So that's probably my best stab at what's next. Annual competencies for the institution.
Well, Natalie, if you had that magic wand to wave and you could change something, what would it be?
So if I had my magic wand, we are, I think we are significantly still failing our families in preparing for discharge and what post NICU life is going to look like. Because I work in the follow-up clinic, the same massive struggles that I dealt with 10 years ago, our families are still dealing with. So if I had that magic wand, there's got to be some kind of a pass off, better education, better family-centered follow up immediately as they get home. And I don't have the answer for that, obviously, and I can't solve that, but I do see that is an improvement that needs.
Thank you so much. So the other thing that I think is so great about both of you is you've been tremendously generous with your time and your expertise here, but that you also offered to share your contact information so that if anybody is interested in learning more about what you do or what your programs look like, what's available through National Association of Neonatal Therapists as far as education or professional development, what parent advocates can do to get more involved. Thank you for sharing your contact information with us. And we'd like to tell you a little bit more. We talked about some various, resources today, alluded to them briefly, but I want to give you the domain addresses for some of these resources. So one is supportforNICUparents.org. One of the things that the whole team realized after we had written and published the recommendations was that there was still such a need for tools and resources and evidence to help support changing practices in NICUs. So if you go to this website, Support for NICU Parents, you'll find all sorts of things. You'll find assessment sheets, you'll find bibliographies, you'll find how to make a case for starting a particular program or initiating some sort of level of support in your NICU that's better than what you're doing now. National Perinatal Association continues to work on these issues and to convene interdisciplinary teams and to publish. In fact, Natalie, right now, it sounds like you're going to be on a new committee because we're looking at what can we do to strengthen and support families as they're transitioning from NICU at home? How do we improve post-discharge care coordination and connecting families? If you are a parent advocate, no matter where you play that role, we really, really encourage you to find out more information about the Preemie Parent Alliance. The Preemie Parent Alliance is a association of parent organizations. So within that group, it's the umbrella organization for programs all across the country that are parent-led and peer-developed. It's a place to go to learn from each other, to find out what's going on, and to replicate successful peer-to-peer and parent support programs across the nation and across the world. Natalie is a part of a wonderful nonprofit organization called NICU Helping Hands. It's based here in Texas where we are, but works to support families all across the country. They have some wonderful model programs for how to provide peer support in your NICU with integrated staff members, which is something that we talk about in some of our other webinars. So again, we hope that you take these resources that we've talked about today, that you take the information, that you've gotten some ideas, and that you now are interested in finding out more and expanding what it is that you can do. We invite you to visit the website for NICU Helping Hands and learn more about their programs and resources and what you can do to support them. There's also just wonderful family stories there also, and testimonials from parents about the sort of improved care that you can get when there is support during these sort of fragile beginnings. We also want to invite you, if you are NICU staff or if you work as part of a special care nursery, there is a whole online course that has been developed based on NPA's recommendations for psychosocial supports. I know that both Janine and Natalie also played integral roles in creating this resource. It's a great way to train staff, to inform new members of your NICU team, and to help set a sort of standard and expectation for the high quality family-centered developmental care that we've been talking about today. We hope that you will visit our website. We're going to have a special page up to support this webinar series and to share all the different resources that we've talked about. You can always find more information about getting involved as an advocate at either of these sites, but like I said, especially at the Preemie Parent Alliance. We appreciate you taking time to be with us today. We appreciate what you do to improve care. Thank you so much. We are so happy that you're here with us, and we encourage you to become an active member of both of our organizations. Thank you.